scored against West Ham? I mean, duh.
It was tied 1-1 for quite a while. West Ham led the game for about 30 minutes.
So I was wondering, with no fans coming and paying tickets to see the matches, how do they pay their soccer players so many millions still in this day and age?
Well, I think a lot of it is advertising, you know.
And TV and advertising.
Yeah.
Okay. So who do you support? I support Manchester United when I think
I'm kind of a Liverpool fan, but I like just watching soccer. I like playing soccer.
I support Arsenal by default.
Well, I had 5 years at Manchester at university, but I never went to see a soccer match at the time. I wish I had, but I was playing rugby most weekends.
When I was a little kid, my dad took me to Highbury a couple of times. So.
Uh-huh.
All right, we're all set up. I think we're live. Let me open up the Google chat here so that we can communicate with the moderator.
Hello, Dave.
Hello, moderator Dave, the man upstairs, as we affectionately know him.
Yes.
Welcome, everybody who's tuned in on YouTube, who is watching this live, and who will be seeing it later. This is Halloween.
It is. And I dressed up as a human.
How unusual.
Yes.
You look like you may be of Scottish or Irish ancestry with
I'm
this
Scottish,
costume.
Scottish, and Scottish.
I see.
But American.
It was Scottish. If it's not Scottish, it's crap.
And today, of course, is a day of national mourning throughout all of Scotland. Sir Sean
Connery,
Scotsman is dead.
Yeah.
Would it be appropriate for me to bust out my Sean Connery impersonation?
Oh, yes.
Well, today we're going to be here with Science Sunday. I hope everyone enjoys it.
Oh, we will.
Yes.
Too bad. All right. All right.
I've got my Pluto hat. I made this hat, what was it, 5 years ago when New Horizons spotted Pluto. It's got sort of a heart-shaped, it's got kind of a heart-shaped thingy spot on it. So this is my Pluto hat. Mike Albro, you've seen this before.
Yes,
I'm sure.
but about the New Horizons, as you know, when it passed to Pluto, there was the song New Horizons sent out. Brian May, the famous guitarist of Queen, who happened to be an astrophysicist, right? How cool is that, right?
Yeah.
So he composed a piece called New Horizons, which they broadcast out to Pluto. It took like no, way beyond Pluto. This was way beyond Pluto, right? This was to that small object. What was it called?
I'll look it up. I don't remember either.
Far beyond Pluto. It's called.
It's an asteroid thing.
It was like a 10-kilometer wide thing that they went right past. It was called
Ultima Thule was its informal name. Now it got another designation afterward, and I don't remember what that was.
Right.
Yeah, but that's one of those big long things and no one knows what it is but you.
It's a big rock.
Just a big bowling pin, you know.
Yeah.
That's a good name. It means the end of the earth, the end of everything, right?
Ultima Thule, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and it's an appropriate place for the far horizons to go.
Mm-hmm. And I have a personal story about Brian May, because apart from being a hero, he lives in the same town near London as my brother and sister-in-law, and his kids went to the same school, and she was at a parents' evening party in the kitchen talking to this guy with long hair. She didn't know who he was, but she chatted with him about half an hour. He's a very nice guy. And afterwards, her friend said, "Do you know who that was?" She said, "No, it was Brian May of Queen." So there you go. I'm two steps away from fame.
Wow.
Well, it's always cool to see him on television as a scientist, and then as we who know him as a scientist and not know nothing about this
rock and roll thing, yeah.
And then he says, "I'm a rock and roll hero." icon. I mean, everybody knows me. And I go, no,
No.
but I know the physicist.
Did you see the movie? Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yes, I did.
Movie,
Dave
yeah.
and I saw it. Yeah.
He's of course a big star in that. Anyway, we're off the subject of science now, but it's cool to have science here. There's another one who's a good friend of mine called Brian Cox, not Brian.
Oh, yes.
Brian Cox.
I know Brian too. Yeah.
And he was the keyboard player in D-Ream, a rock group, which became very popular, #1 hit because they made a song called "Things Are Going to Get Better," and the Labour Party took it up as their theme song for an election year, and so it became very popular. Anyway, he's professor at Manchester, and we've worked together on projects before. So,
and I haven't figured out the close connection between rock and roll and physics, but there they are. There's the two of them.
Especially music and physics. A lot of physicists are well into music, actually. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
For some reason, yeah. But,
Here, let's see if we can change our background
Oh,
today
we're messing with the background.
to a more appropriate scary one here. Oh, how about this one?
Oh, all right. Look at that. We're messing around.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do a background. I don't think I can actually.
Well, you have to have the green screen behind you. You have to wipe out your optically. You have to wipe out your actual background before it will put a background on.
How do I do that? Can
You get this.
You
get
need
this
a green screen.
You don't.
you get
You
this
don't.
thing.
Have,
It's called a green screen. You can buy it.
you don't have to. You don't have to have a green screen with Zoom.
Pay money for a sheet of green.
Do it.
It does depend on the camera, actually. My webcam does not work without the green screen, but except on Skype. Skype's algorithm is much better and it can do it, whereas Zoom cannot without the green screen.
How about that?
Nice.
Ah, is that the blue moon? Looking very orange.
Right. Okay, let's start the science. How about Mike? What the heck is a blue moon?
Right. So once in a blue moon is something that doesn't happen very often. That's why we call it once in a blue moon. And it's when you happen to have two full moons in the same month. Okay. And because the lunar month is 28 days and the calendar month varies between 28 and 31, have 2 full moons in 1 month only happens about every 2 or 3 years, 2.5 years, something like that. And it happens right tonight to today. It's not blue at all, of course. It's just a normal looking color. But so tonight, if you see the moon rising when the sun's setting, they're of course exactly opposite in the sky because it's full moon. So it will be, moons always look bigger when they're near the horizon, and it's a sort of optical illusion, right? When you see it high in the sky, you look up and it looks very small, but when you see it against the horizon, it looks bigger. It's a sort of psychological optical illusion, right? So look for the moon rising tonight after sunsets, soon after, as the sun sets, and there will be a nice full moon. Of course, the moon's size actually varies a little bit because the orbit is not circular, it's elliptical, so sometimes it looks a bit bigger than other times, but only by, what is it, like 5 or 10% or something maximum?
Yeah, and so supermoons, the name in popular culture, and sometimes you see these descriptions or these warnings about the supermoon is coming on Facebook and whatnot. But a supermoon, when the moon happens to be a little tiny bit closer to Earth in its orbit, the moon may look, like Mike said, 5 or 10% bigger in the sky, but that's as super as it gets, unless some cosmic interloper like a rogue planet. I think last time we were together here for Sidewalk Science, we talked about rogue planets a little bit. And if a rogue planet were to perturb the orbits of bodies in our solar system, then maybe the moon would get uncomfortably close. It used to be closer in the distant
It used to be
past.
really close.
That's
oh
right.
Yeah. You go back a couple billion years and the moon was really close. The tides were enormous.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting coincidence that the size of the moon in the sky is about the same as the size of the sun in the sky. Even though they're completely different distances, the sun's much bigger. But because the orbit's not elliptical, when you have an eclipse of the sun and the moon passes in front of the sun, Sometimes it's far enough away in the orbit that it actually doesn't completely cover the sun. And then you get an annular eclipse when it's completely in front, but you see the sun as a circle, so like a ring, hence annular. Other times when the moon happens to be closer, because the orbit is elliptical, it completely covers the sun. And if you're lucky, and the closer it is, the longer it covers the sun for, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and so on. So, so the effect of this change in moon size is very clear when we have an eclipse like that and it covers the sun.
I'm going to change my background to a annular eclipse picture, Mike. How about that?
Yeah.
So we can show our viewers what it looks like.
Toodaloo.
Toodly-dee, toodly-doo.
Lost it. Where is it? It's got to be. Ah, there it is.
There we go.
No, that's total. That's not annular.
Well, that's
the total eclipse. You see what's called a diamond ring here. You see,
ring. Yeah,
because that actually the sun is shining through a crater on the edge of the moon.
Let's try this one.
I think that's a total eclipse, but
looks total to me.
The diamond ring effect is when the sun just barely peeks out, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and you see it during immersion and immersion when the moon is just covering the sun up and it hasn't quite done it yet, or the other way when it's uncovering the sun. That looks more.
Yeah, that's more like an annular. And in an annular eclipse, you won't see the diamond ring because the sun is never completely covered. So that's part of an annular eclipse, not quite central, but it looks as if it would be very soon. The sun, bright sun all around. And then you don't see the corona, and it's not as pretty and spectacular as a total eclipse is.
The other thing that's not so coincidental is that the rotation of the moon matches the orbit. Right, so we're always seeing the same side of the moon.
Boring.
So we never get to see the dark side of the moon, Ivan?
No, the back side. The dark side is not the back side, right?
Oh, could you explain that a little more?
Well, so I remember actually when the first sight we had of the backside of the moon came from a Russian lunik, right? This was before we landed on the moon, so it must have been early 50s, and the Russians sent a rocket around the back of the moon and took some photographs. And that was the first time we'd ever seen the back of the moon. And it doesn't look the same as the front. It doesn't look quite like the front. There's less of these mares, the seas, and so it does look different. I'm quite sure why. I guess it's not. I don't know quite why. Do you know, John? Ivan? Why the back side of the moon is rather different topology than the front side, but it is different.
I've seen hypotheses. I have not seen. I do not believe there is any clear scientific consensus on why.
I read an article fairly recently, and again, I couldn't cite it, saying that the moon is actually lopsided like a bowling ball is, and that during the time when it was coalescing and condensing, the fact that we had two massive bodies sitting next to one another, essentially the core of the moon was drawn closer to the Earth, so it's actually lopsided. And that's one of the reasons why we're always facing the same side. And we actually protect the moon from collision, whereas the backside is totally exposed to the universe and it gets pounded.
Yeah.
But what do I
now? Even before the Russians showed us the backside pictures of it, we knew a bit about it because for two reasons. One is there's libration, which means it's not perfectly always. Sometimes it wobbles. It's wobbling somewhat. You sometimes see a bit more one edge than the other edge. So we actually observed about, I don't know, 55% or so, 60% maybe. The other thing was that you see on the moon rays coming from craters. They're white stripes coming from craters. That ejector that was when the crater was made, it threw out this stuff. And we'd seen these rays coming from around the edge of the moon, coming from the far side. So we had able to map a few of the craters on the backside of the moon by following back these rays. I was really, as a teenager, keen on this. And my neighbor, Patrick Moore, he lived not far away, and he was a lunar scientist. In fact, he's got a crater on the moon named after him because he studied that in detail. So, and he wrote a book called The Guide to the Moon, which was very inspiring to me as a 12-year-old. So I learned about that stuff back then. And I went to his house and looked through his telescope, and he was so kind with me. That was very nice. Very encouraging to kids like me.
The moon is implicated in a lot of scary stories about Halloween and whatnot. And one of the tropes about Halloween is witches flying on broomsticks.
That's tricky.
And since we're talking about space travel, I was wondering if one of you physics professors and physicists have an idea about whether we could ever use some kind of levitating propulsion to get to space. First of all, is there any such thing as levitation? Does it exist? And secondly, could we use it to power a broom or any other spacecraft to get us to the moon?
Well, that's interesting because, you know, H.G. Wells, who wrote the first Men in the Moon story, okay, so his protagonist there is called Cavor, Henry Cavor, and he invented a material called cavorite. He called it cavorite, and it was made in a liquid form, but as it solidified, it became opaque to gravity. This is science fiction, right? So he made a spaceship using cavorite, actually like Venetian blinds, to to get to the moon that way. Of course, pure fiction doesn't work in practice, but that's how, in his story, the first man got to the moon in 1890 something. But no, I don't think you can use broomsticks to get to space. But on the other hand,
we do have levitating trains, right?
We got to we're muted.
I unmuted us just now.
Yeah, maglev trains. That's
absolutely
that's the future of transport between cities, I think. You know.
So why can't we use magnetic levitation to get us to the moon?
Well, because you need to levitate yourself against above some conducting rail or something. You'd have to. It can help lift you off the ground by a few inches or a feet, and so you can go fast. But it can't take you up into space.
Okay. Yeah.
The repulsive force drops off as the cube of distance, which is a very fast drop off.
Oh, wow.
So it only works at close range.
So it's not a square thing like everything else. This is a cube.
Yeah, it's because it's a dipole rather than a monopole. It's because you have a pair. You have a current loop, and it has a looping magnetic field rather than a charge, which has an electric field that goes out radially. And the looping magnetic field, well, the loops close, and because they're closed and they're not forced to go out to infinity like they are for an electric charge, the field falls off faster.
Interesting. So what about using the Earth's magnetic field to repel a broom or a spaceship out into space? Is that possible?
Too weak, very weak. I mean, you can't even use it.
It's extremely weak. Now, the truth is that in spacecraft, we do use the Earth's magnetic field, but not to push us around, but to rotate us.
Oh.
Because you can you can magnetize your spacecraft and make it like a compass needle, and it will rotate and turn toward anti-alignment, I should say, with the Earth's magnetic field. And now the Earth's magnetic field is not symmetric. It doesn't come out at the poles. It comes out at high latitudes, but not at the poles. And so as your spacecraft goes around the Earth, the magnetic field wiggles back and forth. And so you can choose your moments when you do this magnetic torquing to torque in different directions. And you aren't completely free as to which direction you can torque, but you, by choosing the direction so that you torque one way and then you torque the other way, but it didn't completely cancel in some other direction, you wind up changing the angular momentum of your spacecraft basically in an arbitrary way. It takes hours to do this, but in low Earth orbit, but it's a way to turn your spacecraft in low Earth orbit. And it's kind of like sailing, where you're tacking against the wind. Yes, it's a common way to control the angular momentum of a low Earth orbit spacecraft. You usually use it in conjunction with reaction wheels or a momentum bias system, where you have a big wheel going all the time to help you stabilize things. And with a wheel, the direction that you turn is different from the direction that you torque. You precess around the torque axis. So it's a tricky business, but it is a way to orient a low Earth orbiting spacecraft without any fuel.
Is that how they keep the spacecraft, for example, pointed at the Earth for weather satellites and whatnot?
I believe so. I don't know weather satellites. I've certainly used it on a number of astronomical satellites, using it to point the telescope at wherever we wanted in the sky.
Okay.
So coming back to your point, Scott, about can you get into space without, using a huge, massive rocket to get a relatively small object into space is extremely inefficient, obviously. Now we're trying to recover them, but I wondered some time ago about whether you could do something like a slingshot. David and Goliath. So David, he has his sling and he spins it around and he manages to shoot a rock to Goliath at high speed by letting go of the spring. So I had thought maybe, could we make a sort of accelerator of a small satellite with like an accelerating, like a ring 4 miles around the Tevatron tunnel, for example, and you accelerate this rock round and round and round, and then you open a flap and shoot it off right with a ramp up into space. Well, it doesn't work by some orders of magnitude, but it was a thought. Maybe you could make some sort of mechanical slingshot, And if you had a vacuum tube 4 miles around, which would fit in the Tevatron tunnel, and you put your little marble type satellite in there, and you manage to mechanically rotate the whole thing, like you can do with a marble in a tray, or you can get it going round and round and round, and then you let it go. But I didn't take it further than the back of the envelope.
Well, I don't know that the government would invest in a 4 mile long marble accelerator. It's hard enough to get them to work on particle accelerators.
But if you said this marble is actually a military satellite,
Oh, there you go.
There have been such schemes that people have seriously worked on, and also linear schemes. Linear schemes have been a staple of science fiction for 60 years.
Gone.
Robert Heinlein's "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress."
Mm-hmm.
So none of them were able to become practical. Is that right, John?
That's right. The required accelerations are very large, and so the ideas were basically the linear ideas basically involved maglev train type technology, but it's hard to get a really high acceleration with that.
So what is escape velocity? This idea that you have to go a certain speed to get away from the Earth. I don't remember the number off the top of my head.
Was it 17,000?
17,000. Is it miles per hour?
Miles per hour?
That's huge. Yeah.
You can't shoot a rifle with anywhere near that velocity. You'd hurt yourself.
Oh yeah.
On the other hand, we do shoot at Fermilab. We do shoot particles out into space. We shoot
That's different.
So, Mike, why don't you put particle detectors out in space and shoot particles at them?
We do. Well, we don't have to shoot particles at them. because they're moving pretty fast when they're up in orbit, right? So it's hard to send a beam up there.
Okay.
But there are particle detectors in space that detect mostly particles coming in from the cosmos, all right?
Ah,
And there's a big one called AMS, which is Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer, which is on the space station, I think, or attached to it.
It's attached to the space station. It's right next to my nicer mission attached to the space station.
Oh, is it? Okay.
oh, sure. Yours is nicer. I see how it is.
Oh, yeah.
Nice, it was nicer.
The neutron star interior composition explorer. Yes.
Ooh.
Nice.
Well, neutron star, there was just this thing this morning. You had it up there where they were showing the diagrams of the two neutrons coming in and folding in on one another, and then boom, and the particles that were actually the atoms that were actually made as a result of that collision of the two of them. It was quite a nice little feature.
Yeah.
Is that today's news? I didn't see that today news or something.
Well, I believe that the LIGO and the consortium that's been looking for gravity waves just on Thursday or Friday released a data dump that had something like 39 additional black hole and or neutron star collision data sets in it.
Right.
And so,
right. Yeah, they released their data, and people can, I mean, I think even amateurs can look in the data and see if they can spot any extra ones, and they found a few extra ones.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah.
I had a curiosity about that this morning. I don't know if any of you have any scientific speculations or knowledge about this, but it occurred to me that at some point between the time when a neutron star is comprised of neutrons and when it develops a singular event horizon and becomes a black hole, there has to be some, I don't know that there has to be, but it occurs to me that there may be a point in time, a phase transition, when the Pauli exclusion principle that keeps neutrons from overlapping each other, that it's called degenerate neutron pressure. When that degenerate neutron pressure is overcome, but it's not yet compressed enough to be a black hole, and that state of matter must be a very interesting state of matter.
But it can't last long.
No, it can't last, but for
I bet a neutron, I think a neutron star will not be sitting there and then eventually becomes a black hole. It's going to get, if it's massive enough, it'll become a black hole straight away.
Right.
Neutron star will have not enough mass to become a black hole. Right.
Well, does it collide with another one?
Yeah, or unless it accretes mass.
Yeah, another one comes to it and so on. It can maybe.
Yeah.
There are speculations though, right? That there could be such a thing as a quark star.
Yeah. So here's the thought. So when you compress nuclear, this is what we do actually at the Large Hadron Collider, because we collide not only protons on protons, but also lead nuclei on lead nuclei. And they do this at Brookhaven as well. And then you get a phase which is called quark-gluon plasma, where it's too dense to be still neutrons or protons together, but quarks and gluons are freed from being confined, but it's only momentarily because the thing blows apart very quickly and they turn back into protons and neutrons and so on. Now, I keep blowing my own trumpet, but they call it quark-gluon plasma, which is such a mouthful. I thought it shouldn't be called quark-gluon plasma. Let's shorten it to quagma, Q-U-A-G-M-A, right? Which is a much nicer word. And I actually got it into an article in New Scientist.
Oh,
it's
nice.
in the dictionary, but it didn't catch on because it's too much like quagmire, which is a horrible, messy thing. People didn't like to talk about that.
Yeah.
So but it's in the dictionary.
Computationally, it may be accurate.
Yeah, but yeah, at the beginning of the universe, before you had this quark-gluon plasma as it was expanding before neutrons and protons then coalesced and became neutrons and protons. So that's
one of the interesting things I learned when researching my ever forthcoming book.
The infamous, it's going to be a book.
Yeah, was that during cosmological nucleosynthesis, so when the Big Bang energy field, I won't go into details about the inflationary field and all of that, but there is a period of time during the Big Bang when neutrons were created or generated from the energy field prior to protons and prior to electrons. So you might think that electrons being lightweight, electrons would come first, and then protons, because they're the next heaviest, and then finally neutrons would emerge because they're the heaviest of all. But it actually happened in reverse because you had more energy early on, and so neutron genesis happened before proton and electron, and then those neutrons decayed into protons and electrons, and an enormous number of neutrinos, so cosmological neutrinos. But I thought that was interesting that neutrons
I don't actually believe that sequence of neutrons being formed before protons. I think they came at the same time. The mass difference is very small. It's 0.14% difference in the mass between protons and neutrons. I mean, before you had protons and neutrons, you had electrons and quarks, right? And then also muons and other particles that decayed quickly. But then neutrons and protons were formed, I think, essentially at the same time. But then free neutrons decay because they're a bit heavier than protons, so they decay on a time scale of average about 15 minutes. To neutron goes to proton plus electron and antineutrino. Now, modern
at high density, but at high density, neutrons are preferred to protons because of electrostatics. That's why you get a neutron star
instead of a proton star, right?
Yes.
No, well, I mean, we're talking about not neutron stars, but the beginning of the universe, right?
Yeah, well, it was extremely dense then.
Yeah.
It's extremely dense, but I don't think the 0.14% difference between neutron mass and proton mass made any difference. I mean,
probably not. No, the reason we have neutron stars is not because of the difference in mass.
Right. It's because electrons and protons can be crushed together to form neutrons, right?
Yes.
But here's an interesting thing which causes you to think. Our present physical theories, which do not know how it is that the down quark is more heavy than the up quark by a little bit. I mean, they're both very light. But if it was the other way around, and the proton happened to be a bit heavier than the neutron by the same amount, the protons would have decayed, and the neutrons would be left over, neutrons and electrons and positrons.
Wouldn't do much, yeah.
And then we wouldn't have hydrogen. So that would make a big difference to the world, right? We didn't have hydrogen. And it's a small difference.
We don't exist either.
Right.
We wouldn't exist either. And then carbon is another reason for life to exist. And that's another of these miracles that I talk about in my lecture.
Yeah, I look forward to having you present that lecture during one of our Science Sundays. This is a good time for our commercial. This Sidewalk Science is brought to you by the Prairie State Humanists, a humanist group that meets physically when we're able to, just outside of Chicago in the western suburbs. But we have our programs broadcast online, and you can find us on Meetup if you look for Prairie State Humanists. One of our other programs, in addition to Sidewalk Science, is Science Sunday. And tomorrow, Mike Winter, tomorrow is Sunday, and Mike Winter, the other co-facilitator with me, he and I are going to be talking the second part in our discussion of consciousness. So we've both been reading up on human consciousness, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow for Science Sunday, which you can find on our and more information on our Meetup channel. We're also sponsored by the American Humanist Association. Abby, who is not able to join us today, she's out doing election-related activities. She's a newly elected member of the directors board for the American Humanist Association. So congratulations to her on that. Anyway, back to our science. Speaking of neutrinos, this is Halloween, and I want to try to emphasize spooky topics. We can talk about spooky action at a distance, but one of the other things that you've already mentioned, Mike, is neutrinos. Neutrinos have a nickname of the ghost particle or ghostly particles. So are neutrinos are they ghosts? Are they a part of ghosts that are found in living things? What's up with the neutrino? Why is it a ghost particle?
Well, because it's invisible, and but unlike ghosts, it is actually real. but it's invisible, and it interacts so weakly with matter that neutrinos can be made in the middle of the sun and come out through the sun and even through the earth to you and so on. And there's about 1 trillion going through your little finger every second, but you don't feel a thing because they're just so weakly interacting. So to detect them, you have to have a very massive detector, and that's why we build 100,000-ton detectors and put them underground to detect a few a day coming from Fermilab and so on. But they're called the ghost particles because they're just about, you know, invisible. Like
they're hard to detect, but not impossible like the fictitious ghosts.
Right. Well, fictitious. Yeah, some people can see ghosts, right? But you can't.
They claim to.
They claim to. Yeah.
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 So remember that experiment? I didn't have time
yeah.
to look it up in detail. Maybe one of our viewers knows something more about it. But there was some kind of putative experiment that was done, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago.
Oh, a longer time.
More than that.
Yeah, I think it was like a century ago or something.
Where they purported to measure the weight of a human body just before and just after the moment of death. Now, the whole idea of a moment of death is fuzzy, as most things in biology are to begin with. But putting that question aside, I think they found that the human spirit, the ghost in the machine, if you will, weighed 21 grams. Mm-hmm. And I've occasionally seen that figure quoted in different articles and in people that have a more traditional religious orientation, whether that's Christianity or Islam or whatever. But I'm sad. I am genuinely saddened to say that there is no corroborative evidence for that 21 gram soul.
I may have been putting on a lot of ghosts recently.
Oh, yes.
You sure it wasn't 21 milligrams or nanogram? I mean, grams. That's a hell of a lot. I mean, you could easily detect that. But I mean, it's not. I don't think it's a totally stupid experiment, but it's a rather cruel thing to put somebody who's dying on a scales and watch them die and see if they lose weight. And of course they breathe out. You know, you breathe out and you sweat and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and at the time they weren't aware, of course, of dissolved gases in the blood system. They weren't aware of the carbon dioxide cycles, that as you die, you generate carbon dioxide internally, and of course it gradually comes out through the skin and the lungs. And they weren't aware of so many things, but there is a 21 gram difference. As everyone who has dived in the ocean knows, you can really put in an awful lot of gases into your bloodstream, and getting them out can be tricky. So
wait a minute.
You know, if you are at 15 pounds of pressure and suddenly you're croaking, so all of a sudden your heart isn't working, your lungs aren't working, your blood isn't working, and you just exude all the oxygen and nitrogen that used to be inside of you just comes out. And so
21 grams, 21 cubic centimeters of water. I mean, it's a hell of a lot of weight. I mean, are you sure it's not 21 milligrams or something like that?
21 grams.
So I found the Wikipedia article. I'm not
21 grams.
I'm not citing this off the top of my.
And it was, of course, then you look at the experiment itself. I'm not sure what weight this person was, but let's say it's a 150-pound person, and you're going to measure the difference of plus or minus 21 grams. That's pretty darn good.
Yeah. So the study was in 1907. I'm just reading this in the article. It was in 1907 by Duncan McDougall.
Oh, a Scotsman. Well, if it's Scottish, it's got to be genuine.
From Massachusetts. And he found the 21.3 grams.
0.3.
Yes.
On one person, or did he do it on many people?
Let's see. McDougall hypothesized that souls have physical weight and attempted to measure the mass lost by a human when the soul departed the body. McDougall attempted to measure the mass change of 6 patients at the moment of death. One of the 6 patients lost 3/4 of an ounce, 21.3 grams. McDougall stated his experiment would have been repeated many times before any conclusion could be obtained. The experiment is widely regarded as flawed and unscientific due to the small sample size and the methods used, as well as the fact only one of the 6 subjects actually had any noticeable change, and that was 21 grams.
Yeah, in the last 100 years, I mean, you'd think it would have been repeated, and you could. I'm sure you could measure a loss of much lower than that these days. You know, a few
Well,
grand even, but
it
but-
has, and that's the point about dissolved oxygen and the water and everything else. All physicians know that when you die, your body changes in its weight, and they just go, oh yeah, don't worry about it. As far as physical measurements, it depends upon the person. It depends upon their health at the time, whether or not they just sort of croaked automatically, or if they had a long, prolonged period of decline. Were they on a respirator? You know, all this stuff plays into it. So there's no real good way of measuring anything like that, except yep, they're dying.
In 2001,
I mean, we probably sweat about half a kilogram a day or something of water, don't we? We
Yeah.
sweat a lot. I mean,
but
Oh, here we
gain
go.
weight.
whatever it is.
Here we go. Oh, go ahead, you could read it because
All right. In 2001, physicist Louis Hollander Jr. published an article in Journal of Scientific Exploration where he exhibited the results of a similar experiment. He tested the weight of a ram, so not a human being, 7 ewes, 3 lambs, and 1 goat at the moment of death, seeking to expound upon McDougall's purported results. His experiment showed that 7 of the adult sheep varied their weight upon dying. Though they did not lose it, they rather gained 18 to 720 grams, which was lost again over a period of time until they returned to their initial weight.
But the flaw in that experiment was that we all know that animals don't have souls. Only human beings have souls. Right?
Oh, good point, Mike. Good point. So along these lines, Ivan, I notice just from other interactions that I've had with you over the past week or two that you got into a discussion with somebody recently about, I think, wasn't it dualism? And didn't that entail whether souls exist or not? Maybe this is a topic that you enjoy expounding upon.
It was a discussion about essentialism versus nominalism.
Okay.
Which is something else. Essentialism is the idea that when you see a pattern, like a species, like cats, right? There's a question: could there be a substance, something like catness, that cats have, or there's certainly a pattern there, right? We can certainly tell that there's a pattern among species that we call cat, and our brains, our neural networks, have learned to recognize this pattern. But going back to Plato and the Greeks, and then through the scholastics, there was this idea that there's an essence of cat, and maybe there exists this essence in a Platonic space or in the mind of God or something like that. But there's another possibility, which is just that there is no essence there. It's just a pattern, right? That the pattern matcher exists in our brains.
Mm.
So it's this way of saying, you know, it.
Even are
Go
there,
ahead, Joanne.
are there,
I know that there's a special thing for cats. It's called cations.
Cations, right?
yeah. So Ivan, I wonder, you know, there's a huge variety in the appearance, especially of dogs. You have tiny dogs, huge dogs. Are there dogs that are indistinguishable from cats, or cats indistinguishable from dogs? I mean, is there a fuzzy border between them where you couldn't say, looking at it, whether it's a dog or a cat, or are they really distinct because there's catness and dogness business?
I imagine. I mean, the only basis for any answer I could give to that is when I've seen cartoons and I'm like, is that a dog or a cat?
Yeah, Pink
that's
Panther
kind of
looks a lot
scientific
like a
as a cat.
dog, doesn't he?
Well, the biologists, of course, will tell you that they're different species because you cannot breed a cat with a dog. You can breed a cat with a cat and get another cat, and you can breed a dog with a dog and get another dog. But even though they might look quite different, you know, there are mixed breeds. My son has a golden doodle.
But, cats and dogs have common ancestor, right? I don't know how far back the common ancestor was.
Well, if you go back far enough, they're all weasels.
Weasels.
The
Yeah, you go all the way back.
Well,
There's
you
a
know,
the common ancestor is a
wolves and so
weasel-like
on,
creature.
you go farther back, and we have a common ancestor with them. You know,
yeah.
Right.
But there was some time when
I
they
was
were
just-
obviously interbreeding, and then something happened to stop them being successful at interbreeding, and they became separate species.
yes.
Before,
Now,
before
I've
we
recently
that
go-
is
been-
that, you know, that works for cats and dogs.
Hmm.
There are what are called ring species, where there is a territory that contains a creature, and the creature from one end of the territory cannot interbreed with the creature from the other end of the territory, even though the population can interbreed with similar creatures that are that are intermediate.
Right. The valley in California, I believe it's the one that includes the Salton Sea, maybe called the Imperial Valley, has exactly that. There's a species. I read about it recently in one of Richard Dawkins' books that they meet somewhere, I think at the southern end of this valley, the Coachella Valley, and on either side of this valley, it's a many hundreds of miles long valley. On either side, the exemplars of that population cannot interbreed, and but as you go further north, they start being able to interbreed. So the dividing line between the species is a bit arbitrary for much of the distance. But then when the two lineages geographically meet up at the south end of the valley, they are so different that they cannot breed. And that's exactly one of those ring species you're talking about.
And the other thing is that there are what are considered different species that just have poor breeding outcomes, but not impossible breeding outcomes. And that seems to be why we have in our genome some Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah, we were. Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think you're like a pair of trousers. You know, where does one leg start and the other leg start? Because there's a connection between them. So, you know.
Yeah. So Richard Dawkins calls that the tyranny of the discontinuous mind.
Ooh.
Actually, he calls it the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. The idea being that in biology, especially, there's a continuum, right? There is no hard and fast delineation between plant and animal when you start really looking for the border. When you start looking for the border between living and non-living, that border gets grayed out by things like viruses and catalytic reactions. And so there's a temptation among taxonomists and zoologists to very clearly delineate and define a species. But Mike, you're exactly correct. From a biologist's standpoint, there is a commonality to all living things. And the question of when does a given branch of a family turn into another species is a fairly complicated one. And back to your original question about the relationship between cats and dogs, there is a newly extinct, like within the past 100 years, extinct creature called the Tasmanian tiger. And the Tasmanian tiger was actually a marsupial, but it had features that were both feline and canine. The idea being one of what's called convergent evolution, that if you fill a similar ecological niche, if you have a particular pattern of behavior, whether you're diurnal or nocturnal, whether you're a predator or a herbivore, etc., that many different environmental factors produce a particular environmental niche where a species can thrive. And different species have evolved over time to fill similar niches, and many of these species have similar characteristics, even though genetically we would identify them as very distinct species. So, for example, the Tasmanian tiger had stripes like a feline tiger, but it was, as I say, a marsupial. So some of the same characteristics, including the need to be camouflaged in grass, right, with the vertical stripes, evolved to be manifest on a Tasmanian tiger. And there are many examples of convergent evolution. Both dogs and cats are predators, so they share certain characteristics. And at some point, I'm just speculating, at some point, maybe 50 million years ago or so, they very likely shared a common ancestor. So
well, if you look at foxes as a distinct group of dogs, there are several foxes that climb trees and act and appear, in fact, a lot like cats. So that's where that closeness between the two species exists. But then again, if you look at a timber wolf versus a lion, you go, well, there's nothing at all that's similar to them. So we do have that convergence in there.
right. Even bears have some similarity to dogs.
Bears are overgrown dogs.
Yeah.
But bad temper.
Then we have flying foxes that actually jump off tree branches and glide for a long way, right? They're flying foxes. But they don't have much, well, they're not related to birds further, except further back than the dinosaurs were related to the mammals.
So Ivan, how did your discussion about, what was it, essentialism versus, what was this?
Versus nominalism. Yeah, this is a different sort of slightly off from what we were talking about. But if you look at the philosophy of Aquinas, for example, it's a very elegantly constructed philosophy, but it's all based on the idea that of universals, of there being essences. So essence, like even existence has an essence, almost like it's something you pour into something potential in order to make something exist. And if that assumption that universals are not essential, that they don't really exist, right? It's not as if there's something like catness that is more fundamental than cats, right? That the pattern of cats as a species is quite
It's
accidental.
only manifest in cats, right? Right. It's, yeah, you have to have a cat in order to have catness, is what you're saying?
I'm saying that catness, to the extent that it exists, well, catness as an essence exists only in our heads.
Oh, I see.
We have this network in our brain that's capable of recognizing cats. And you might say, well, cats have 2 ears and they have fur and 4 legs. But if you saw a cat that had lost its leg and one of its ears, you'd still go, oh, that's a cat. Because your brain is integrating lots of pieces of information. And then when it reaches a threshold, it says, that's a cat.
Yeah, I think catness in that sense is a real quality. But when you use the word essence, catness as an essence, is that essence sounds like something material almost, it's it's not material, I think, but it is nevertheless a real thing that there's a catness and a dogness and so on, but they're just not material as far as I suppose, right? But
well, there's a real pattern there.
Yeah.
But there doesn't need to be more than a pattern. There doesn't need to be something fundamental that the pattern is reflecting.
Oh, I see.
So it's not like a soul, in that in order for you to be a cat, you have to have a cat soul. In order to be a dog, you have to have a dog soul.
Well, the Thomists, that's named after Thomas Aquinas, they would say, I guess it's actually Aristotle's philosophy. It's the idea of formal cause, right? That the form of an object is caused by something. Like the form of cats is caused by the form of a cat or something, of a platonic cat. I don't know. We don't need any of that. If you lose that assumption, then that entire philosophy basically falls over.
But when you, instead of talking about a cat, you talk about an RNA molecule or DNA molecule. Okay, that's a physical object. Okay, now is it just the combination of the atoms in the molecule, or is there something else? Okay, or is it just this pattern? I mean, I'm taking it down from cat and dog down to DNA.
Right. Well, one of the other things I've read in in my studies of biology is that there's a common analogy that's used that's not advisable, and that analogy is equating genetic code with a blueprint. Now, the reason that's not advisable is because a blueprint specifies in detail and represents in detail every eventual construct that results from that blueprint. So you can think of a blueprint as a kind of homunculus, you know, the idea of the human being that lives inside of a human being that pulls all the human strings and whatnot. A blueprint is fully a specification.
Yeah, it's a spec.
Right, it's a spec. A better analogy that many biologists prefer, instead of DNA being a blueprint for a cat or a dog, is that it's a recipe. And you know, those of us who have spent time in the kitchen know that, you know, 2 cups of flour, an egg, some milk, some yeast, some sugar, and some heat. Well,
bread.
That's
maybe.
Yeah, who knows what you're going to get, right? I mean, you can put all those things together, but without adding some process or some environmental factors, you just get a mess.
Oh, it is.
Right? So DNA is a recipe for which kinds of products to create, specifically which kinds of proteins, and some proteins are enzymes, some proteins are structural, etc. DNA is more akin to a recipe than it is akin to a blueprint. And then, just like a recipe, that recipe interacts with an environment. A recipe interacts with ambient temperature room and an oven or a microwave, etc. Well, DNA interacts with the environment of an egg, or in the case of a mammal, a womb, and the rest of the cell. So the DNA also interacts with all of the machinery that goes into making a cell work. So the DNA doesn't exist by itself.
Also suggests that there are 2 parallel recipes, and sometimes one recipe takes precedence, and sometimes the other recipe takes precedence. And so even though you have 2 seemingly identical recipes, they are different. And this is where gene expression comes in.
Dominant and recessive.
Dominant, recessive,
right.
and therefore the recipe is, it's a mess.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in this, but I think of DNA as a template rather than a recipe. A template. So it's got other individual atoms come and sit on the template, and they form proteins. So the DNA is like it's like a printing press. You print protein after protein after protein, the same ones, and it can print different proteins. And some proteins are useless and some become useful. But the DNA itself, I mean,
if it's a template, I think it's a template for a recipe.
Okay.
There's a beautiful one of the books I read, a fascinating book called Life Unfolding by Jamie Davies, and it explains how you start from a fertilized egg and how it grows into a human. And it's fascinating how the different parts of the template turn on and off at different times, and how cells signal each other with concentrations of chemicals, and how they grow, such that it's basically, because the template is the same in every cell, but the cells express themselves differently depending on their environment. And it's the dependence of the local environment, between the cells, those gradients of concentration determine how our bodies grow.
And as you know, there are a lot of people who shall be nameless who believe that when the sperm fertilizes an egg, 2 cells come together, and your 21-gram soul enters it at that moment of conception.
Heck of a zygote.
And it knows whether it's going to become a human or a chimpanzee at that moment, right? And only it goes into human conceived cells and not to chimpanzee conceived cells.
I should make a comment here. There are many things one can build with electronics. One can build amplifiers and oscillators, and one can build digital logic and all this stuff. I have actually done microchip design where I've put all those things on a chip, And it's all in the pattern. There is no essence. It's a matter of getting the right pattern of doping of the silicon onto the surface of the silicon. And that makes, different parts of the silicon chip do different things. You don't pour an essence into it.
Right.
Ivan, it looks like you're on fire. There is smoke behind you. Just a warning.
Are you okay?
I'm
Okay.
fine. There is no Ivan, only Zool.
Fantastic. Fantastic. This leads us naturally into another topic I wanted to cover today. And that is about freakishly scary equations.
Ooh.
Freakishly scary equations. There was recently, Ivan, I think Ivan discovered this before I did, and I discovered it because Ivan shared it on Facebook. There was recently some very significant, like factor of 1,000 progress made in terms of being able to solve numeric simulations of partial differential equations.
Ooh. How was that?
And I'm not going to try to explain that. Ivan, would you mind taking on the role of telling us what the heck is a partial differential equation? Maybe you can relate it to what we talked about with regards to flows and densities and whatnot, and then why this new discovery might be important.
So there are some physical systems where we know how to describe in principle what is going on, where variables in the system depend on changes, or the changes in some physical quantity depend on various factors, and we can write down exactly how this system will evolve in the future, in theory. But it's very difficult to calculate. We can't solve this equation and get a nice simple formula that tells us how to draw the final result. So, for example, we can look at the weather patterns around the Earth, and maybe we can write down a formula that would describe, in theory, assuming that we could calculate it, it tells us, well, we have this much sunlight coming in, and we have this much pressure over here. So we know how things should evolve over the next, let's say, millisecond. But there's no simple formula that we can write down that we could just, use this simple formula to say, what is the weather going to be in 3 weeks' time? Well, one day's time, for that matter, right?
One of the ways I've seen it described is, if you remember your high school algebra where you solve for x and solve for y. In order to solve for both x and y, you need two equations that have a very specific kind of relationship where you can separate out the x-ness and separate out the y-ness. And with partial differential equations, one of the challenges is the x and the y, or many other variables, like in the weather, you've got heat, you've got humidity, you've got radiation reflectivity from the Earth at different wavelengths with different energy intensities. You've got many, many different variables. And so to solve it precisely, you might think that you would need as many distinct equations as you have variables. Well, partial differential equations tell us a lot about the relationships that nature creates between those interdependent quantities. And it helps us specify the quality of that relationship, whether it's an inverse squared relationship or an inverse cubed relationship, like John was talking about earlier with magnetic fields. So partial differential equations help us understand the relationships between these physical variables. But in many, many, if not most cases of the natural world, we cannot reduce that to an algebraic solution where we can solve for x, or solve for the temperature, or solve for the wind speed. And all we know is the relationships. And the best we can do is do numeric simulations of these equations to come up with ranges of possible explanations. And in the past, up until recently, many of the more complicated ones, especially dealing with weather, I've heard that the second biggest, most powerful computer on the planet is dedicated to weather forecasting. It is such a complicated subject with so many variables and so many relationships among those variables. The first most complicated one, unfortunately, is dedicated to simulating nuclear weapons. But in any case,
it's a very similar problem, actually.
It's a what, John? I didn't hear you.
It's a very similar problem, actually.
Right. Yeah.
It's the same math.
Also, I think the elements of chaos come in where a very small change can result in a big change in the future. So, I mean, you can imagine. So you talked about several variables. You talked about, Scott. You said heat, humidity, wind, this, that, and the other. So that is, let's say there's 8 variables. Okay. So you can imagine 8-dimensional phase space. And the present situation is one point in that 8-dimensional phase space. And as time moves on, that point wanders around, okay? And that would be a deterministic thing in 8-dimensional space, which you might think you can calculate. But there are points where it can go 2 different ways, depending on where, it's the whether, a bird fell from the sky or something like that, or whatever. So it's not deterministic, right? So
and it's usually non-linear, which means that you're calculating what is going to be, let's say, the change in the wind speed, but that change depends on whatever the current wind speed is. So if your calculation is if your calculation is off by a little bit, it can make a huge difference in the outcome. So the story, this is a group out of Caltech and Purdue, came up with a way of solving these numerically, or they're applying AI to try and solve this problem. So the idea is, okay, so what we mean by differential equation is we're looking at the slope of a curve, or like the speed of some movement. So it's like some distance divided by some time, for example. And so what we do is that in a differential equation, you're taking the distance divided by the time, but you're making the distance and the time get very, very small. So you can try and get it. What is the instantaneous speed? It's kind of what it's calculating. Well, we can't make the distance infinitely small, but with a computer we can say, well, let's make a very small distance and a very small time, and then calculate what that is. And maybe we can find out how big this small motion is, and then you can see how the system moves through time. This is actually very difficult to do, right? Trying to solve, I was trying to think of a good analogy, and what I was thinking is, imagine that you have some terrain and you want to find the lowest point in this terrain. What we would do is we would just look at the ground and say, okay, that part looks lower, and we'd walk there. But when it comes to computations, we can't see anything. We can only just make estimates, right?
You have to build the terrain before you can traverse it, right?
Well, we kind of imagine that you just pick a coordinate. It's a bit like playing Battleship, right? You pick a point, and then you go over and you calculate and you look, am I at the lowest point, or what is the slope of the ground where I am? And if the slope is not flat, it means that you're on a hill and there must be a lower point.
But you end up in a secondary minimum that's not the real minimum, right?
Right.
And a lot of theorists think that our vacuum in the universe is not in the lowest energy state, but there's an even lower energy state, and that we're unstable, and somehow the whole universe could tunnel into this other state that's even lower, and then boom. But I'm reminded, actually, in England when I was young, we used to say that the most successful weather forecast for what it's going to be like tomorrow is just to say it's going to be the same as today. And that's usually a good product prediction, better than the radio forecast.
Well, weather prediction has actually got a lot better. I mean, I know that people like to say, talk about how bad the weather forecast is, but there are measures of how good the forecast is, and it has been getting better. So it is definitely better than it was, let's say, 30 years ago.
Well, one of the things that's implicated in weather forecasts and nuclear explosion simulations and the design of aircraft and spacecraft and aquatic craft and any number of things is a beautiful little formula that was written down, I don't know, about 100 years ago, called the Navier Stokes equation.
Yeah.
And this equation specifies, let's see, how do I describe this? It contains all of the mathematically relevant calculations required to fully specify the flow of a fluid, including its direction, its density, its direction X, Y, and Z. You know, sometimes it bubbles up over an obstacle, sometimes it moves laterally, etc. So the Navier-Stokes equation is one of these partial differential equations that specifies in a scientific vocabulary the flow of any given fluid.
Up to a point where it becomes turbulent, and then it broke down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this particular simulation, or this computer code, Ivan, that you're talking about, was applied, I believe, to that Navier-Stokes equation, and it does a better job of providing numeric estimations of the solutions to that equation in a particular context. It provides those numeric solutions 1,000 times faster, using 1,000 times fewer computing cycles than any other currently available method. And they trained this using some kind of AI mechanism. And this, Ivan, you may very certainly know more about how that all fits together than I do about the AI training and whatnot.
And by the way, about nuclear explosions, when the atom bomb was being invented in the Second World War, they didn't have digital computers, right? I mean, they had analog computers in the form of slide rules, right? And they did it like that. And they had to calculate what was the probability that the whole atmosphere would go boom if they had and they figured out, no, it was not going to happen. So that's safe enough. But,
the thing to remember about Navier-Stokes is it is itself an approximation, because the fluid is composed of molecules. That in itself is an approximation, but let's go with that one. And so rather than tracking the motion of every individual molecule, which is, you could write down those equations in principle, take you forever, but you know, they are constructible equations. Instead, what you do is you make this continuum model where you turn that collection of equations into a partial differential equation. And the weird thing is that the discrete thing with the molecules had a finite but extremely large number of degrees of freedom. Now you turn it into a single equation, which is an approximation, but has an infinite number of degrees of freedom. But that approximation is more tractable in terms of practical calculation, because then you can do a finite element approximation of that, where you divide the fluid up into, you know, for weather simulations, it's multi-kilometer scale cells, and compute what is happening between the cells according to the differential equation. And that gets you to a practical solution. But that's physics for you. We never get to really solve the problems using the fanciest math that we know. We always have to go through layers and layers of approximation in order to get an answer.
Sean Carroll, the physicist Sean Carroll, who I greatly admire and follow many of his works, has talked about this idea of effective theories, that you know, in principle, you could start with quarks and gluons and electrons, and in principle, you could write down this full specification for a cat, let's say, to keep with our Halloween theme. But in practice, that there's no mechanism for simulation, including the human brain or any computer, that has the computing power to fully capture the details of that nearly perfect specification. So we make effective theories that take shortcuts, like the putative ideal gas law, which is based upon an assumption that the particles in the gas have no volume in of themselves. They take up no space. And so the Navier-Stokes equation, Stokes is one of these sort of approximations rather than based on infinite regress all the way down to the level of fundamental particles.
There is one computer that can do what a brain does. It's called a brain.
Right. Yeah. So Ivan,
an analog computer, by the way.
Yeah, well, this is what, when people tell me that physics, that they make the mistake that physics is mathematics. And I point out that mathematics doesn't scale like the physics does. It's incredibly hard to do a good simulation of a small molecule and figure out what its ground state configuration is, while a molecule itself figures it out in picoseconds.
Right.
And it's a very simple thing.
It's like the protein folding problem, right, John?
Yeah, the physical world figures out its physics very efficiently, and the mathematical stories we tell about it are quite illuminating, but they're actually not terribly effective at telling us what's going to happen.
Yeah, you're reminding me this thing called lattice quantum chromodynamics, or lattice QCD, where they try to calculate the masses of particles like pions and protons by putting space-time, which is normally continuous, on a lattice of space-time points. And they do these calculations, and they spend thousands of hours of computing time to calculate the ratio of the mass of a pion and a proton, for example. And it comes out, but nature does it, bang, like that. You create a pion and it gets the right mass straight away.
Every time.
Every time.
Every time, everywhere, every when. Yeah.
Yes. So, we're not that smart.
That's right.
So Ivan, we've got about 10 minutes left. I don't know. I want to give you the opportunity, if you're interested in taking it, in talking more about these learning algorithms and whatnot. That may be something you're interested in talking about.
I just want to say a few more words about it, but I did look at the paper briefly, but I'm not really enough of an expert to be able to, since I saw it this morning, to be able to translate it into very much. But part of the issue has to do with how you have to customize these numerical algorithms, right? So I talked about how you might, like playing a game of Battleship, right? Where you have a grid and you're sort of guessing points on this grid to try and figure out where might the lowest point on this terrain be, right? Well, imagine that I have a grid, but instead of just a Battleship grid where I have like 10 by 10, it's 50,000 by 50,000, and maybe I'm trying to figure out what is the lowest point in the Grand Canyon, or maybe what is the lowest point in the field in my backyard, let's say, right? These are two different problems, and you have to choose your scales in the problem so that when you blindly make a guess, that your algorithm doesn't trip up based on the numbers, right? So it needs to converge on the right answer. And so you have to customize your algorithm for whatever terrain that you're looking at. Well, what they did is they use an AI to try and solve a problem, and to do it very generally. And not only were they able to solve this generally, but also to accelerate the whole process. So it really sounds amazing that they've found a way of speeding things up by a factor of 1,000 and reducing the error in the final result by like it's by a factor of 30, if I recall correctly.
Wow.
But Ivan, don't you have to scan the whole parameter space to check that you're going to the lowest point rather than a secondary minimum?
There's no general method for being sure that you have found the lowest point rather than a secondary minimum. And so actual algorithms for doing this involve heuristics that have guesses as to how far you have to look and, how finely you have to look and all that. And indeed, a large part of the job of the numerical analyst is tuning the algorithm to the problem, exactly what Ivan said. I do this all the time. I'm an instrument designer and I'm constantly doing circuit simulations, and they always need tuning.
Well, one of the general comments I'd like to add to this is, why is finding the lowest point in a terrain interesting or scientifically relevant? And my initial answer to that is because many of you who are watching this have probably heard the idea that any system that has a particular energy level or energy excitation will tend, through natural processes and the action of natural law, to transition to a lower energy state. In fact, it will tend over time to transition to the lowest possible energy state. And so finding the lowest energy state for a natural system, whether it's a gas, whether it's the atmosphere on a particular day, whether it's particles in a particle accelerator, finding the ultimate resting place in terms of energy is important and helpful.
An analogy: if I'm here and I'm inside of there, everything is up. I can never get to here. And that's a far lower energy state than this one is. And that's the problem we're discussing. If this is my terrain and these two are possibilities and I'm in here,
you're only looking
I'll never see there.
Right.
Because I have to go up, gain energy before I can find this to lose energy.
Right.
And that's an ongoing problem with all of these things.
And there are a lot of mathematical problems where even if what you're dealing with is not energy, it still turns out that the equations are analogous, and the lowest number of some measure of what your function is, what your numbers are, is the best answer you can get. So that's a very common problem.
Here's a practical thing, Scott. So you probably read Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he has ice 9 is a state of water, right? Which is actually a solid, but it's more stable than normal water. But if you drop a crystal of this ice 9 into water, it all goes boom, it all goes ice 9. So that's part of the story, which is, by the way, a great book, Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. So
and he got it. Was it his brother who ran into this in real life? It wasn't water. It was barium titanate or something like that.
That had a phase, yeah.
Which was being used as a piezoelectric material in sonar microphones. And the process that made it suddenly stopped working. And the reason is because there were two crystalline forms, one that was the common crystalline form and another form that was more stable but had never been seen. But a particle of the more stable form got somehow introduced into the process. And the factory that was making this stuff couldn't make the normal form anymore.
Wow.
Is that a true story or science fiction?
I believe that is a true story.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mentioned before the possibility that the vacuum might not be in its actual lowest energy state. And here's another amazing thing is that some theorists will calculate, if you consider the mass of the top quark and the Higgs boson, and you put them on a graph where they are, then they figured out that the vacuum is metastable, and it depends on the masses of the quark and the Higgs boson. And it's a rather narrow window. And if either of them had been different in mass by 10%, either the vacuum would have been unstable and woof, it would all change. And the universe would change totally instantaneously, I don't know, or it would be totally stable. So it seems like, so that is a mind-blowing thing. Perhaps I don't fully understand it, but it's one of these miracles that allow us to be here. There's a top quark mass and Higgs boson mass are just right. Wow.
Well, we're we're at our 90-minute mark for today. This is Halloween. This is our Sidewalk Science Halloween. We've talked about cats. We've talked about ghost particles and the idea of human ghost and the 21-gram idea that has been fully debunked historically. And we've had a great discussion overall. I really appreciate those of you who tuned in today. Dave said that at one point there were 10 viewers, but other people will be able to see this on our YouTube channel subsequently. And we'll be able to see you again in 2 weeks. We'll be back for another Sidewalk Science. Thank you to Ivan and Mike and John and Joanne, my co-host, for joining us for another.
And Scott.
Scott Thompson, thank you to our viewers.
Vote.
Bye.
Vote. Right.